Hello, my wonderful, beautiful friends, guys. Welcome back to our /MaliciousCompliance, where people follow orders to the letter to spite someone. And in today's episode, it's all about people getting back at power-tripping Karens in their workplace. And OP tells a story about the time they complied and destroyed a CEO's cushy career. Guys, I hope you enjoy the stories. Don't shake your heads too hard. And as always, you can send or link your post to this email right here. Let's dive in. Okay, so I once had a project manager who acted like she ran the place named Shirley, and a coworker named Alex. I was a computer programmer. Every morning, we, along with half a dozen other people, had a 5-minute long meeting to discuss our progress and to give people a chance to ask each other stuff. The boss was away on a 2-week vacation, and while he was away, the meetings were slightly more important, so we could coordinate ourselves without him to do it. Right before the meeting, I had come to a roadblock because I couldn't remember what something in the programming was called. I just needed an actual word, and I could continue, and I knew Alex would know it. So at the meeting, Alex did his thing, and a few other people talked, and then it was my turn. I explained what I had done yesterday and what I was working on, and then I said, "Hey Alex, do you remember?" At this point, power-tripping Shirley interrupts and she throws a screaming fit at me. She says, "How dare I try to have a discussion with someone without her?" I pointed out that she was standing right there, and she demands to know how dare I try to talk to someone without it being a scheduled meeting in the conference room in her presence. I pointed out that this was a scheduled meeting. We were in the conference room and we were in her presence. I then tried to explain that it was a very brief question, and she flipped out. How dare I try to talk back to her about this? So having gotten an idea, I asked when we could have this meeting. She said 3 p.m. Now, I knew damn well she had nothing to do before then. She just wanted to have something she could feel smug about. And I want to note, it was 9:34 at the time. She told me that I was not to discuss it with anyone before the meeting, and I was not to proceed on the task without it, or I'd just be proving it wasn't actually important and I was wasting everyone's time. So with that, the meeting ended and we left. And here's the thing. Alex worked about 10 feet away from me, so I could have just walked over and asked him, but I didn't. He then sent me an instant message, wondering if I wanted to ask him over messaging so she couldn't hear. I replied that no, she wanted to be rude about it so she could reap the rewards of her actions. Alex and I also had lunch every day, but on this day, I declined to talk about it. And at this point, he knew I was up to something. At 3 p.m., he and I went to the conference room, and 10 minutes later, she swans in. She closed the door, sat down, opened her notebook, uncapped her pen, wrote down the date and time and who was there, and told me I was now authorized to proceed. So I went and said, "Hey Alex, do you remember that time last week when we did this task and you used a thingy that did this thing? What was it called?" Alex told me, and I replied, "Great, thanks." And he and I both turned to leave. It had taken all of 20 seconds. At that, Shirley flew into a rage. She said that I was deliberately making a mockery of her by scheduling a meeting for something that would take 20 seconds. As I left the room, I said, "Shirley, I warned you that this was a 1-minute exchange, but you insisted on a meeting." She didn't speak to me for the rest of the day. I made sure that my timesheet reflected that I spent from 9:35 to 3 p.m. doing absolutely nothing, waiting for Shirley. A day or two later, she flew into a rage at me again, and the entire staff was so enraged, they told me they were quitting and asked me to join them. I asked them to wait a couple of days, and then called my boss and told him. And on the next business day, I found out he returned early from his vacation and fired her. Oh, and random fact. Over a year later, Alex and I both moved to another company, the same one. When we arrived, we found that Shirley was already there. We both went to the boss and told him that under no circumstances were either of us ever willing to have a meeting with her without him. He told us that she was already not in good favor, but he'd make sure to not allow it to happen. Actually, he went to the CEO and told him that under no circumstances would anyone from the whole department meet with her ever. Then came the day that she threw a screaming fit at somebody that was heard across the office. She stormed out and was never seen again. The secretary, knowing I had worked with her before, asked me if I knew what her home address was, so he could mail her things from her office to her. I didn't, and I suggested he ask HR. The guy couldn't be bothered though, and a year later, they were still in a box ready to be sent to her. I think they got thrown out. Good frickin' riddance. And honestly, with a temper like that, maybe Shirley shouldn't be working with others ever. Like, I just don't get how people could scream at others like that, especially in a professional work environment. Absolutely unnecessary, right? But hey, some people just can't get out of their own way long enough to succeed. And again, with a temper like that, I don't think Shirley will last long at any workplace. So at my job, every day, I have to travel between two offices. I start at my main office, and then I have to travel to the second office, and then back to my main office. Because I'm using my personal vehicle for this travel, the company pays me mileage. Well, there's basically two routes you can take between the two offices. One's about a mile round trip shorter, but has tolls. So I always took the 1 mile longer route to avoid the tolls. I did it this way for about a year. Well, in comes the new bookkeeper Karen, and she's hell-bent on saving the company money. And where does she think all this wasteful money's going? Expense reports, obviously. So she starts to nitpick every report. Like, if someone's out and they have to buy some pens for work, she goes online and she finds the cheapest price possible for those pens, and only reimburses for that cheaper price. It obviously has pissed a lot of people off. Well, she eventually decides to target me. I submit my report for 2 weeks, and a few days later, I get the reimbursement payment. Well, it's $5.85 short. So I ask her about it, and she says I've been ripping off the company for the past year by taking the longer route between the two offices. She then said that she will only pay mileage for the shorter route from now on. And she says to me, "You're lucky I don't go back and take back all the extra from the past year." Now, before I could tell her that the shorter route has tolls, which will add up, she cuts me off and said, "End of discussion." So I say, okay, but to please send me an email that states I must take the shorter route, and that this is company policy, and then leave her office. Before I even make it to my desk, I have the email from her confirming what she said. 2 weeks later, I submit my expense report. I reported the shorter route, so the company saved $5.85, but the tolls added up to $136, a net loss for the company of $130.15. It's been 6 months, and I'm still taking the shorter route, and this is costing the company an extra $130.15 every 2 weeks. This extra cost to the company went on all last year, and by my estimates, it cost the company about an extra $3,500 last year. So the third week of December, we have our annual budget review with all the department heads. It's usually a quick chit-chat how things went over the year, and then we all get a nice catered lunch, but this year went a little bit different. First, Karen Bookkeeper asked that we have a projector set up in the conference room so she could give a presentation on how much she saved the company since she was hired at the beginning of the year. Now, this was great for me because I prepared my own presentation. She starts off the meeting going over each department, going over the changes she's made to save money. Her big cherry on top of her savings was how much she saved by cracking down on excess expense reimbursements. Now, I should also say here that she's not liked by any of the department heads. Most of the employees have complained to their department heads about her BS, and they've been forced to just take the complaints with no power to do anything about it. I, on the other hand, am a one-person department. So her presentation ends with a big hooray on how cutting down expense reimbursements has saved the company a whole $3,500 last year. Then we start going over each department's budgets. Everything's going normally until they get to my budget. And that's when my boss asked, "Wait, why is this so far over budget?" And this is when my short PowerPoint gets played. Bring up the first slide. It's the slightly longer route I was taking between offices. I explained that this was the route I was taking and what the mileage reimbursement was. The next slide was the new shorter route. I then explained that Karen forced me to take this route because the mileage reimbursement was less, saving the company about $5.85 every 2 weeks. Then I showed them the next slide, Karen's email. Included in that email is a part about this being final, and there will be no further discussion on the matter. The final slide was the toll reimbursements I was paid throughout the year, including the approximate total that was the result of this new shorter route. I then explained that had I been able to discuss this matter with Karen, I could have explained that the shorter routes had these extra tolls, and I said that's the reason I'm so over budget this year. The room went silent for what seemed like forever. The owners of the company then asked everyone except Karen to step out of the room for a few minutes. When the door opened back up, Karen walked out silent. She went to her desk and started packing up her things. That was the end of Karen. Honestly, in my opinion, that $3,500 that Karen saved the company throughout the year by penny pinching wasn't worth everyone hating on her and putting a target on her back. With that said, guys, if she was so meticulous when it came to tracking every single expense, how in the world did she not notice the company was reimbursing OP a few $100s per month? Maybe that's why they were so quick to fire her. I have no idea. So here's some backstory. I was a general troubleshooter for my company. My job involved a lot of traveling to different clients we support. My area of work is Ontario, Canada, where I'm based out of, and some of the nearby states in the US. I did most of my traveling by car, since my schedule can change quite quickly, and flying can become very expensive. I also had one colleague who's technically my subordinate, but we have a very good working relationship and would often handle calls independently of each other, only checking in by phone once a week and in person once a month, when necessary. With that said, a little over a year ago, I get an email calling me to the head office in New York City for a meeting with the CEO and the board of directors regarding my job. I check in with my colleague and he got the same email. So we make our travel plans and we meet in New York City the following week. We have dinner together the night before our meeting, and I can't figure out between us what this issue is about, because it's rare to get summoned to the head office and more rare for things to be so vague. When we go into the meeting the next day, we're informed that the company's dividing our department between US and Canada, and there's gonna be a new person to deal with the US clients, and that we were to restrict ourselves to Canada. Both my colleague and I were a little shocked at this, since neither of us had ever heard this being discussed. I then asked who the new person for the US was, and that's when we learned it was a new hire that the CEO had taken special interest in. Now, trying to be of good spirits, I offered to train the new person. The CEO accepted and then brought in the new hire. In walks in a young lady who looks to be about 23 years old, and she wears an expression that she knows everything. She sits at the table and immediately makes it very clear that she wants nothing to do with us. CEO Bob says, "Welcome, Karen. We've just informed OP and Jim about the change in structure, and they're willing to give you the support you need to get yourself started." Karen and Bob both look at me, and I say, "I'm glad to have you aboard, Karen. I think that both Jim and I have a lot of experience to share with you, and we're happy to do so. Perhaps it would be better in a separate meeting so we don't take the board's time." Karen replies, "Thank you all. I have a lot of ideas about how I can streamline our department and new policies I can introduce that should save the company a lot of money and expenses." At this point, I'm very confused. Karen is speaking as though she's my supervisor, and that's not what Bob spoke to us about. I can see some of the board members giving strange looks at this as well. I then speak up and say, "Bob, perhaps I misunderstood the new roles here. Would you please clarify?" Bob then says, "Sure. So Karen is the new head of your department, and both you and Jim will answer directly to her." This is when a board member speaks up and says, "This isn't what we discussed or approved as a board. We weren't fully convinced of dividing the department, but this is completely against what we discussed." Karen then says, "What did you discuss then?" Board member says that your department would be divided between US and Canada. OP and Jim would remain north of the border, and you would run the US. Karen then says, "That's not what I was told, but I can work with that, as long as these two don't get in my way," indicating me and Jim. Of course, Jim and I are both shocked and insulted to be spoken of in this manner. We're both very good at our jobs, and before today, we've never ever seen this woman in our lives. Bob then says, "That settles it. OP, effective immediately, you and Jim are to have nothing to do with Karen. Do not interfere with her work at all. You're both to restrict yourselves to working within Canada only." And with that, he ends the meeting and left the room with Karen close behind him. Jim and I sat there stunned for a moment, and some of the board members came up to us to express their shock and sympathies about this. I had enough presence of mind to ask if we would get a written directive of this change, and I was assured we would. Sure enough, both Jim and I got emails with a new directive from Bob by the end of the day. So after sending an email to all of our US-based clients advising them of the change, Jim and I made our way back to Toronto and reorganized ourselves for working within Canada only. This meant much less traveling for us, so it gave us more room to breathe. Within a week, I was getting complaints from our US-based clients that Karen was not answering emails and she was missing appointments. I forwarded all these emails to Karen and copied the entire board, including Bob. Another week later, I get a phone call from Karen, who sounds frantic, but she won't admit she needs help. She makes pleasant conversation, and then she asked how I would handle this particular type of situation. So I tell her I'm really not interested in discussing work, because that might be seen as interfering in her work. Later that evening, I get a call from Jim, telling me that he had the same conversation with Karen, and he handled it the same way. By the end of the month, I get a call from Bob asking if I'll take over the entire department again. I politely tell him no, since I do not want to interfere with Karen and her role. So for the next 3 months, I'm getting emails and phone calls from the US clients, asking if they can have me back as their contact. And this confirms an idea that I had in my head. Jim and I had actually grown our client base in Ontario since restricting ourselves here. So I had lunch with Jim one day, and I asked him if he wanted to go into business with me as partners to start our own consulting firm. By the end of lunch, he was on board, and we start the necessary steps to get set up. As soon as we were clear, we both submitted our resignations with explanations of why. The next time clients contacted us, we told them that we no longer worked for the company. When they asked if we still worked in the field, we told them that we had our own firm and what services we offered. A month later, we had 60% of our US clients on board. And since the former company had no Canadian support at all, we had 80% of the Canadian clients. Within 2 months, we had 80% of the US and 90% of the Canadian clients. In the year since that time, our new company has grown enough that we've hired 7 new consultants. Jim and I find ourselves doing more office work than road work and a lot of client courting. Our old company has had to stop offering the in-person troubleshooting, what our department did, and Bob was fired by the board. I have no idea what happened to Karen. Update. So because of the interest expressed in the comments, I made a phone call to one of the board members I remained on friendly terms with. Here are some answers to some questions. Number 1. How did Karen get the job? Apparently Bob had set up a business school scholarship out of his own money, which had put something like 6 or 7 students through business school. Karen was the latest graduate, and Bob wanted to give her a start in the business world. Number 2. Was Bob sleeping with Karen? No clear answer was given, but Bob's wife divorced him shortly after he was fired from the company. Make of that what you will. Number 3. What happened to Karen? Apparently, she got a job as middle management in a financial services company. Hopefully, she can still build a life for herself, and she's learned some important lessons. Lastly, what happened to Bob? The last I heard, he was a regional director for a large hotel chain. Hopefully, he also lands on his feet, because everyone deserves a chance to make a life for themselves. Also, some questioned why the board was there for the meeting. I honestly don't know, and neither did the board member I spoke with. It was one of their regularly scheduled meetings, and Bob just added things to the agenda. Some have also questioned my use of non-competes, saying it's not nice. It's a normal reality in the business world. The oddity is that my old company did not have one. I freaking love this malicious compliance so much, guys. Like, nothing like starting your own successful business, taking your old company's clients and doing it better than they did before. I also want to say that I'm actually surprised that a company like that did not have a non-compete in OP's contract. What a huge mistake that was. And as for the CEO losing his job and his wife, I think we can all agree that hiring a pretty young girl that he had special interest in was definitely not worth it. At least, that's what I think. So this happened a good 6 years ago now. I was just starting my IT career, so I was basically a level 1 desktop engineer for a large financial company. My team consisted of me, a level 2 engineer, and 3 managers. 1 for data, 1 for people, and 1 overall manager. Parking in town was either expensive or impossible. Management and supervisors got parking spaces in the huge multi-story next to the office, while other staff members didn't get one, and they either had to pay the very expensive parking fees or park far away and walk. Being on a low entry-level salary, I opted to walk the 30 minutes into town. The level 2 guy lived a 5-minute walk from the office and didn't own a car. When any of the managers were off, they offered their parking space to me so I wouldn't have to walk, which was very nice of them and greatly appreciated, as it was saving me money too. Well, one day, I get called into HR because someone saw me walking out of the multi-story and got jealous, and asked why I get a space and they don't. This HR manager was incredibly condescending, and they talked to me like I was a child, with lines like, "Back when I was your age, I thought the world owed me everything too," which is absolutely not my attitude, but sure, go off on me like you know me. She then said it wasn't fair on the level 2 guy because he might want the space too. She wouldn't listen when I said he didn't drive. At the end of the day, I went to the management office and we were chatting about the day as I usually did. I told them about the HR meeting and said they weren't allowed to let me use their parking space anymore. This is when the data manager had the genius malicious compliance suggestion. She was a very selfless soul who sacrificed much of her time to help other people, and this situation rubbed her the wrong way and she wanted to do something out of spite. She said that whenever any of them were on holiday, they would just tell me that their parking space will be empty for the duration, not specifically that I can use it, which is what we were told not to do from HR. So the next time they were on holiday, I parked in their space. And after a few days, someone else got jealous and they tattled to HR again. I was then dragged into a meeting and asked why I was still using their space. I said that I just took a chance on an empty space I found in the multi-story. They were rented, not pay and display. HR went and asked the data manager when she was back in if she said I could use the space, to which she said, "No, I just said goodbye before I went on holiday for 2 weeks." HR then told her that I was in her space in her absence, and then asked if she wanted to raise a complaint against me. She said, "No thanks, I wasn't using it anyways." Their hands were tied, and there was nothing they could do to prevent me from using the spaces, as they're allocated privately to the individuals for use, even outside of office hours, and only reclaimed when they leave. Talk about a frickin' power-tripping HR dummy, right? Clearly preying on the low-level guy. In my opinion, the manager should have had a meeting with HR and straightened that stuff right out, because that is absolutely ridiculous. Like, I would have given HR a puzzle or something, because clearly somebody is too bored and looking for ways to be useful at work. Toby is the frickin' worst, right? And that, my friends, brings us to another end of our /malicious compliance. Guys, I hope you enjoyed today's stories. If you did, hit that thumbs up. And if you're not subscribed, consider subscribing so you don't miss these crazy stories. And if you missed yesterday's episode on the channel, it's in our /I don't work here lady episode, where Karens are causing trouble once again and getting arrested in foreign countries. It's a wild episode, so go check it out if you haven't. And myself and Stevie Boy will see you guys in the next one. We love you.